This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees-Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
3 minutes after 9 on Monday, January the 7th, and a new year and a new opportunity to call Jacob Rees-Mogg. I remind you, as if you need reminding, he's, of course, Conservative MP for North East Somerset, but important in the context of today's conversation, he chairs the all-important Conservative European Research Group, or ERG, as it's known, and I understand that your group, or indeed one of your colleagues, is releasing a paper, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Welcome to the show. Happy New Year to you and your family first off. What can you tell us about this paper?
Thank you, and likewise, Happy New Year to you and your family. The paper's been produced by Peter Lilly, who was Trade Secretary some years ago, and therefore is a great expert in this field, really putting to bed some of the scare stories about WTO and what would happen if we leave to WTO terms, starting with the idea that it's not crashing out, but it's cashing in, because you'd save £39 billion of taxpayers' money that you wouldn't have to pay if we went to WTO terms. But other things, such as the EU wouldn't be able to put a punitive tariff on the UK's goods that didn't apply to the rest of the world. So yes, it could apply the common external tariff, but it couldn't say, well, these goods are from nasty Britain, and therefore we're not letting them through Calais, or we're applying a punitive tariff, because that's not allowed under the WTO rules. And the EU is actually pretty good at sticking to its international agreements.
OK. What else is it that in your report, or sorry, your group's report, that my listeners should take note?
Well, the trade will carry on because people want to trade is an underlying assumption, and it's essentially 30 points of rumours and scare stories that they will have heard that aren't true. So it's basically a WTO mythbuster to give people comfort that trading on the WTO is a sensible thing to do, and it reminds everybody that our trade on WTO terms has grown faster than our trade with the EU since.
But it's a smaller percentage, presumably. It's a smaller base, I would imagine, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Not anymore, it isn't. That it used to be, you're quite right. But when the single market was established, the EU was comfortably over 50% of our trade. It's now well below that, and our non-EU trade is heading towards 60%, which is primarily WTO-based. There are side agreements around the WTO, but a lot of these don't actually relate to trade. So I think there are nearly 100 side agreements with Russia on how you trade with Russia, but half of those are separate from the specifics of WTO trade.
Coming to the first call, Krishna, you will be the first call in just a moment. Final point, as you and I are speaking, Mr. Rees-Mogg, if you look at the monitors, the television screens, you will see that there's coverage of this Operation Brock, which is this test using Manston and a former RAF base. They're holding lorries in Kent and then seeing if they can hold them there as a sort of pen before going down to the ports. Meanwhile, dredgers are in action in Ramsgate to possibly make room for a ferry service that the company has commissioned that doesn't have any ships. Is this the Brexit my listeners and your supporters voted for?
The key point made by people who are likely to be your listeners, that's been made to me over Christmas, is that they voted to leave. And that's what will happen on the 29th of March. Whether there is this withdrawal agreement or whether it's on WTO terms, the key is that we leave. And that, I think, is what people voted for.
A leave like this, Mr. Rees-Mogg? Dredgers working with ferry companies that doesn't have any ships, a lorry park in Kent?
But I don't see what
stockpiles of medicines.
But the Secretary of State for Health has said that there won't be any problem with medicines being delivered to people. It's surely sensible to make preparations for unknown eventualities, and you always prepare for things that may go wrong, not that things are certain to go wrong.
A bit late. So, I appreciate the timing wasn't from you, but shouldn't this possibly have been commenced about a year ago?
That's a very good case to be made, that things should have started earlier. But of course you make preparations, that not everything will go according to plan. Nothing in life ever does. No. And the job of government is to be prepared. Look at what happened at Gatwick just before Christmas with the drones. Because of that, airports are now making preparations for drone activity to a much greater degree than they did before that happened. What is being done in terms of leaving on the 29th of March is making preparations for things that may happen that are unknown, and that is a prudent course of action.
The one thing that we can always count, of course, is the Queen's Christmas message. But that one thing always, Mr. Rees-Mogg, does go through without any impediment, of course. We go to the first call. Krishna is in Finchley. Krishna, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Your question. Good morning to you.
Right. Good morning, gents. Nick, good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Good morning, Krishna.
Right. Good morning. What question? I've got a couple of, three things that I want to point out first before I put my question to you. The government's Migration Advisory Committee proposed that anyone earning less than £30,000 will have difficulties or will be banned, actually, from coming into the UK to work, which has been which has been termed as an ignorant and elitist policy to get only the skilled migrants from the European continent. I speak on behalf of a company that I run, which is a labour-intensive industry, and I'm also very strongly affiliated in the voluntary sector with restaurants and catering. We see that the labour market in this country, at the lower tier, is very much made up. 3 in 5 workers, in fact, are from the European continent.
I've got to start to move you towards your question, if I may, sir. What would your question be, please? Thank you.
The question would be why are we putting so much restriction on the lower-skilled workers, whereas we, the companies, need these people to work in our industry? Because when we put out an advertisement in the newspapers or on the windows or word of mouth or the job centres, we don't get anybody from the homegrown sector coming in and asking for the employment position that we offer, but from the European continent.
Don't go. I just want to get Mr. Rees-Mogg involved. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, thank you. It's an interesting question that you raise as to why would you set a skills limit or a salary limit for work visas. The difficulty with unrestrained migration from the European Union is the effect it's had on the least well-off in the United Kingdom, people who are already here. And that although businesses have to some extent benefited because it's held wages down, the other side of that bargain, the people employed, have had their wages held down. So you see the least well-off in our society have not seen their take-home pay increase over the last 20 years very much. And that is something that as a society we should be concerned about, and taking control of our borders and particularly reducing the number of lower-paid jobs that are available to people from outside the UK will help the least well-off in this country.
But what about Krishnan needing his staff and colleagues and others who run industries, trades, jobs, businesses like them? What are they going to do?
Well, it's a question of supply and demand, and that if you wish to create the supply, you have to pay more. So there will be increases in pay for the least well-off in our society.
Did you agree with that 30,000 cap, that rather arbitrary figure?
I think you need to look at some figure, whether it's 30,000 or 29,000 or 31,000. Can be argued about, but I think the basic point that immigration is not a problem for really high-skilled jobs. It's not a problem for scientists going to work at universities. It is a problem for the least well-off in our society who find that the jobs that they would have got are now only paying an amount that attracts people from overseas and not people who are living in this country already.
And if you and I were running a series of coffee shops or hotels, might we not be rather concerned we won't have any young people to make the beds or make the coffees?
You and I, when we go into coffee shops, may have to pay a little bit more for our cups of coffee to ensure that the least well-off of our own society gets slightly
fellow
better.
Countrymen and women come and make the coffee and make the beds.
Look, we will have a choice. Are we going to look after the least well-off in our society by benefits taken from us through taxation, or by ensuring that the jobs that are available pay them an amount of money that means they can live in our society without that level of benefits?
Get a response from Krishna. Krishna, a quick response from you, sir, before I move on.
Yes, very quickly. The point about the low paid in this country and looking after them, I totally appreciate it, and I think we should hand out and help people in the lower paid sector or whoever they are that don't have jobs. But the acid test, Mr. Rees-Mogg, is the fact that if you look, it's not just about the money, it's about the cultural thing, that if people do not want to do the hard grafting, the labor-intensive sweat work, we are offering people not the minimum wage, the London wage. Sometimes we go over the top and offer a little bit more. Still, they're not interested. One day they will come and the second day they'll say they're sick or they're not well or whatever. These people that come from abroad, the continent, they are so reliable that we can put our shops to their hands and say, look, there are the keys, run our shops for us.
Let's get
That's the type of...
I hear what you say, this extraordinary dedication, perhaps by people who realise they're rather lucky to come to a country, whereas you could argue some perhaps rather take it for granted. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, I'd say that I've worked with lots of very reliable British people who turn up to work and work extremely hard.
I doubt that you've worked in a coffee shop, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
No, I haven't worked in a coffee shop. I'm a little suspicious of this idea that the British aren't willing to work and are fundamentally lazy. I don't think it's true. I think there are inevitably some of us who are more idle than others.
But why are all the coffee shops full of Romanians and Poles and Portuguese kids?
Because it's a very attractive first job to get if you've just got into the country, and it tends to be relatively lowly paid compared to other jobs.
What's attractive about having to get up at 5 in the morning to make the stack the sandwiches and make a cup of tea?
Well, you're earning 3 times what you would earn if you were in Romania.
Why doesn't the British kid do that?
Because he's not earning 3 times what he would get in Romania.
Chris is in Twickenham. Chris, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg, and morning, Nick.
Hello. Good morning, Chris.
I worked in pharmaceuticals for 10 years, including for GlaxoSmithKline, one of the most successful exporters in this country, in the FTSE 10 company. The former senior manager at Glaxo, who's now the head of the ABPI, the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, has warned that we cannot leave the European Union with no deal, and has said clearly that there are certain medicines which cannot be stockpiled. How do you reconcile his opinion with your continued assertion that no deal is acceptable for this country?
Because goods coming into this country are under our own control. So who is going to stop pharmaceuticals coming into this country?
The point is, you cannot. Certain medicines cannot be stockpiled.
No, I'm not talking about stockpiling. Who's going to stop pharmaceuticals coming into this country?
Well, the point is, at the moment, they are planning for chaos at the ports in this country. Or are they not?
Do you recognise that they're planning for chaos, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
They are making plans in case there are problems in Calais, but there are all sorts of other ways of bringing drugs into the country.
Well,
the drugs that you can't stockpile, you can fly in.
Right.
Some drugs.
So it's like a Berlin airlift, Mr. Rees-Mogg, in reverse.
No, I think talking in these exaggerated terms is hysterical.
I'll bring you back in. Let's just hear from Mr. Rees-Mogg. Chris, hold one line. Let's come to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
There are some drugs that you can bring in and you can stockpile for a long time. There are some drugs that have short lifespans. Temperature-controlled drugs. You just have to arrange the way in which they're brought in. But we are under control of how things come into this country. The only risk you're talking about is that if Calais gets blocked, then the Dover-Calais route gets blocked. But other routes have much longer lead times, and therefore there aren't likely to be blockages at those, so you just have to bring things in via other routes.
Chris,
this is not particularly complicated.
Chris, I will bring you in. We spoke in the first hour with Mike Thompson, Chief Executive of the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, and he told us this, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Every member is doing that. And I think that's why patients can be reassured that we are doing everything in our power to make sure that we can get our medicines to them, even though this is the biggest logistical challenge that we are facing. And our message is, when parliamentarians come to think about the options ahead of them, no deal is something which they should avoid at all costs. I don't want to get involved into the politics of this.
That.
I'm just saying that no deal creates significant challenges for us. We're as prepared as we can be, but undoubtedly things will go wrong. You know, there are over 12,000 medicines which are licensed to be used in the UK. That's a massive challenge for us.
No deal is to be avoided at all costs, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
First of all, the issue of licensing, that will be under our control. So those 12,000 medicines will all remain licensed. What is being suggested there is that there is a punishment of us by the European Union when we leave to block up the ports. That it's assuming not only that we leave and move to WTO terms, but the EU then breaks its international agreement under the WTO. This is the whole point of Peter Lilly's paper. This is assuming that you can't trade unless you're in the European Union. It's fundamentally false. Lots of countries trade outside the European Union and don't have clogged up ports and get pharmaceuticals delivered to them. It's assuming that the EU...
That's not changing a 45-year agreement, probably. That's why it's a different situation, of course.
But there is another agreement. There's the WTO on which we can trade. And you've got to ask yourself, why would the EU break its other international agreements? Why would businesses make their own lives more difficult? And why would the UK introduce arbitrary checks to make things more difficult? None of this is going to happen. It is part of the Project Fear, and it's making assumptions that will not turn out.
All right, Chris, quick word from you, then I must move to another call. Chris?
I have to say, that is breathtaking arrogance, considering that someone like Mike Thompson works in the industry for 30 or probably most of his career. The point I want to make, what about new medicines? If a pharmaceutical company wants to register a new product, if we leave the auspices of the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, they will have to go for a second additional registration with our equivalent, which is the MHRA. That is a fact. That is going to eat into the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies and put off smaller, innovative medicines from being applied for, and it will delay new medicines. That is a fact, Jacob. How do you say that? What do you say to a cancer patient that has been waiting for an innovative treatment for years? and their life depends upon it. That is a fact, Jacob. You cannot dispute that.
Let's go to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, Chris, what I'd say is that stating an opinion and then calling it a fact doesn't make it a fact. That is your opinion. Pharmaceutical companies register their drugs all over the world. It's a perfectly well-known, well-tested program. Indian pharmaceutical companies have themselves inspected by the US Federal Food and Drug Administration to ensure that they can sell their drugs in the United States. The pharmaceutical industry is fundamentally global, and the EU is not going to stop our pharmaceutical industry being fundamentally global.
Chris, thank you. It's a related call next. Steve in Shrewsbury. Steve, you're on the radio. Good morning to you.
Yeah, let me talk about facts, Mr. Mogg. You say that, things will go through nice and smoothly and we'll get all the drugs through and everything else. Lovely. Well, last year, I desperately needed a piece of equipment to come from America to help save my wife's life, who had cancer. It arrived in the country brilliantly in a couple of days, fabulous. And then it sat in customs for about 3 weeks. And the only reason it eventually got released was because I kept begging them to let it through and explaining what it was for. And that was when the customs was running normally. Can you imagine the mayhem that's going to happen when we're trading and there's all the disruption? And even when it's working properly, it takes weeks for things to get through customs.
Can I ask the condition of your wife before I hand over to Mr. Rees-Mogg?
She died.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I'm obviously very sorry to hear what you've said.
How many other people are going to die because of the way you're acting?
I will come back to you, Steve. Mr. Rees-Mogg.
The issue with imports from the EU is that the head of HMRC has said that this is precisely what they are not going to do. They are not going to apply the approach that they take to the rest of the world to goods coming in from the European Union, because they're going to prioritise flow over checks at the point at which we leave, if we leave to WTO terms. But I think the argument that comes from what you have told us is that we should improve our overall trading systems. One of the things that worries me about the government's no-deal planning is that it's proposing to apply the level of bureaucracy to exporters to the EU to the same level as those that exist on those who export to the rest of the world. And I'd have thought what you're telling us and what common sense would tell you is that this is a great opportunity to reduce the bureaucracy around all trading, to open up our market to the whole world, to facilitate the flow coming in from the United States, from Canada, from India, to ensure that people can get the products, the goods, the services that they need, and that is the lesson. It's not a lesson about whether or not we should leave the European Union.
That's a response from Steve.
The lesson is, yes, by all means make the imports come better from the rest of the world, but not at the same time as you're crashing out of the European Union, because that's just going to breed mayhem across the board. Get it right first on one area before you start messing up another one.
Isn't Steve right? The pressures will be enormous. And you concede yourself, Mr. Rees-Mogg, it's not going to be perfect. Nothing in life is perfect, as you said, so there will be issues at ports and airports. The added burden will be phenomenal, as Steve has illustrated, surely.
But the position of the government and of HMRC is that they will not put any additional checks on in the early stages, that there won't be any changes of this kind.
We've got that experiment Operation Brock in Kent now.
But that's right, but that's in relation to what the French may do, not what we may do.
Right.
But the point that Steve is making, our current import regulations are primarily EU. Everything to do with trade is an EU competence. It is not a UK national competence. That's what we handed over. That was the main thing we handed over in 1972. Other things since. So if people don't like how trade is going on at the moment with countries outside the EU, their complaint should go to Brussels, not to Westminster.
Quick final point on this, and we move to other areas. Steve, final point from Houston.
I needed something else, another piece of equipment which came from Europe. I had to order from Europe. That arrived in the country the next day, by next day delivery. There's the difference for you, for when you're desperate for medicine or medical equipment or someone trying to keep someone alive.
The point I was making was that the import rules on the item you were seeking from the United States, imports are primarily controlled by the EU, not by the UK.
Steve, my condolences to you, and I'm sure I speak for you.
Indeed. It's very sad.
And thank you for your input. Let's move to other matters. there were a couple of prominent people writing in the Sunday Express yesterday, one of whom was you, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
And the other of whom was you.
Thank you very much indeed. In which you stated that many members of the Conservative Party think the fears are exaggerated, and a recent poll showed that 57% of the Conservative Party prefer a no deal to 23% for what's known as the Theresa May deal. Is she out of step with her party?
Well, and I think the polling seems to indicate that the country at large is not keen on the withdrawal agreement.
But what about Mrs May?
The Prime Minister's deal does not have support in the Conservative Party at large, and there was a thought, or at any rate one read in newspapers, that we were all expected to go back to our constituencies over Christmas and people come up to us and tap us on the shoulder and say, why don't you back Mrs May's deal?
Yes.
To the extent that this happened to me, it happened in precisely the other way, that people are so polite, and they'd come up and say, I know this isn't the right time, but please stick to your guns. There was nobody who came up to me and said, you must back the withdrawal agreement.
What about this idea that some Conservative fundraisers, some constituency associations are even talking about strike action? You're aware of that?
Only from the Sunday Express. I didn't know about that
What would you
beforehand.
say to them?
I think the Conservative Party should support the Conservative Party. That's what we exist to do. And that associations should work together. We've got local elections coming up in May and so on. And I think adopting the TUC's approach is probably not the best thing for the Conservative Party to do.
Matthew's at Heathrow on an associated question. Matthew, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead. Morning to you.
Yes, morning, Jay. So basically, I want to ask, what does Theresa May has to do for you to vote for the deal in Parliament? I mean, I've been involved in European transport all my life, and basically we're not ready for WTO. That won't work.
Well, Matthew, thank you for your question. The withdrawal agreement has many faults with it. The primary one is, of course, the backstop, because the backstop would leave us indefinitely in the customs union, and indeed it would be harder to leave that than it is to leave the European Union altogether. There's no equivalent of Article 50, but it also proposes a different regulatory regime for Northern Ireland as against Great Britain, and I think splitting our country up is simply improper. It is not something I could conceivably vote for. So the backstop needs to go. And you then need to look at what we're buying for the £39 billion we're spending, which is currently absolutely nothing. That there's no certainty of any future deal, any future trade deal. So there needs to be some linkage between the money we're spending and the future trade agreement.
Supporters would say, of course, it does lead to trade. I have to say that. That is what Mrs May would say, and it protects British jobs.
It doesn't do any of these things because it's just paid. It doesn't guarantee that we don't end up on WTO terms anyway at the end of the process. It doesn't guarantee us an agreement. And it's paid. There's no conditionality. And you will remember that initially we were told that the money would go and the agreement, the trade agreement, be ready for signing a few days later. But all that's gone. So it's £39 billion for nothing.
Matthew?
Well, no, but even if we end up on the WTO deals, we'll have time to organise. Literally, over 2 months is not enough time. We're paying that $39 billion, so we could have another 2 years of frictionless trade, and then we could work to either get the trade deal, what will solve the Northern Ireland issue, and because we're just not ready for the WTO.
I think the argument on WTO will always be the same, that people will always say that we're not ready for it because it will be a change, and that people who are trading with the EU inevitably don't want change because they're used to the system that they've got. But the question is whether £39 billion is value for money, and it's not buying a standstill. If it were doing that, there may be an argument for it, but it's not even doing that. All it's doing is buying us the opportunity to end up in a backstop which gives the European Union all the leverage in future negotiations. It is a really extremely bad deal.
What do you see happening over the next 8 or 9 days of debating in the House?
Well, we're hearing that the government is going to try a number of approaches to make people more sympathetic to the deal without changing the substance of the deal. And I'm afraid we've heard all that before in our relationship with the European Union. That an old city saying, when a man says his word is as good as his bond, take his bond. And I've always thought one should bear that in mind, and therefore, if the EU is at any stage, though it doesn't seem to be yet, willing to offer us commitments, they should be legally binding within the withdrawal agreement. They should not be a council statement or any protocol or lesser form of words. Because we saw with the protocol on the Lisbon Treaty that we were told we wouldn't be affected by the Charter of Fundamental Rights. This turned out to be completely meaningless. So it needs to be the body of the text that is changed before we could have a legal agreement that was satisfactory.
When your Conservative colleague Ken Clarke calls for Article 50 to be revoked to buy more time for the UK, saying, quotes, there's no majority for anything, how do you respond?
Well, Ken Clarke's always been opposed to us leaving the European Union. He wants to stop it. This is completely consistent with his long-held beliefs, but it doesn't match the referendum result in 2016 when we voted to leave. And that question was very simple. Do you want to leave or do you want to remain? People said leave. They didn't say we only want to leave if we get a particular type of deal. They heard all the project fear that's been reiterated this morning. They just voted to leave, and that's what we've got to deliver on.
But they didn't vote for £13.8 million being given to Seabourn Freight, a ferry operator that hasn't... And I appreciate this isn't your decision, but this makes it farcical, doesn't it? This is almost... Well, if it wasn't so damn serious, you could laugh.
13.8 million compared to 39 billion is not a great deal of money.
You're not justifying Seabourn Freight, are you? This ferry operator with no boats.
They don't get any money until they've got boats and they're doing something, as you know.
Yes.
So they only get paid if they succeed. It's a start-up business. It's an effort to have alternatives from Calais. It's an amount of money that won't be spent if it doesn't happen. And
You're not very critical of it, are you?
Well, I
thought you'd have lampooned it.
No, because when preparations are being made, there will always be one or two preparations that you can say, do we really need to do this? You know, the story that we might run out of Mars bars. Perhaps in the Rees-Mogg household we'll be stockpiling Mars bars.
Indeed.
And then that would give everybody a laugh. But the overall effort is what's really important. The efforts that are being made to ensure that Operation Brock is effective and that therefore what is going on between Dover-Calais can be managed in the event that the EU wants to punish us. It's only necessary if the EU seeks a punishment Brexit.
81 days and we just start dredging at Ramsgate. I appreciate you don't take these decisions, and unfortunately you're taking the brickbats as if.
Well, I'm happy to.
I appreciate you probably would have started dredging the next day. I've no idea, but this is absurd.
Obviously, we should have got ready immediately after the referendum, and that should have been a major part of the government's negotiating strategy. And it was obstructed by certain people within the government. We all know that.
That'd be the chance of the Exchequer.
You might say that. I can possibly comment.
You didn't shake your head.
No. for those who are not watching the online streaming, I probably nodded. And so you have to make preparations. They should have been made earlier, and some of the things will be easy to mark, but nonetheless the overall level of preparation needs to be pursued.
Two key other areas for Conservatives are involved in, which moves us away from Brexit, but I've got emails and texts that people want your view. Yesterday, in a different Sunday paper, the Sunday Telegraph, Liz Truss seemed to suggest that white elephants needed to be looked at, and it's brought into association that maybe HS2 is not the future, as it is suggested that costs have gone from 56 to possibly £100 billion. HS2, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Margaret Thatcher once, when picking up litter, said, bag it and bin it and that way we'll win it. I think binning HS2 is an easy save, and any sensible government would want to save this ridiculous amount of money, and we mustn't be led astray by the sunk cost fallacy. That is to say, we've already spent whatever it is, £1 billion, £2 billion on it, but that it would be better to stop now than to plough ahead and spend another 98 billion badly because we've already spent a couple of billion.
And lastly, you, I'm sure, are a keen student of history. You'll know that the NHS started life in 1948. Since then, it's had 14 reviews, some of them 10-year reviews, some of them 5-year reviews. We have the latest, which is pumping yet more money into the NHS from the Conservative government. A, will it work? B, is it money well spent?
I share your suspicion of 5-year and 10-year plans.
I get to about 130 years we should have got to by now, roughly.
How many tractors are we going to produce? Not many NHS. I think the extra money that's come partly as the Brexit dividend is very sensible. I think that was clearly needed, and that the NHS does need to have an idea of where it is going. What you always know about these plans is that if we come back in 10 years' time and have another one of these calls, A lot of things within that plan won't actually have happened, but some of the really important things will have done, such as increasing the number of places at medical schools so that more people are trained domestically, and removing the cap on the numbers so that any qualified person can go through medical school, providing a surplus of potential employees, which is really crucial.
God willing, we see each other in 2 weeks' time, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Who'll be PM?
Theresa May.
You're listening to LBC 9:33. News is next.
Speaking to LBC, Tory MP Jacob Rees-Mogg has dismissed concerns about a shortage of some medicines in the event of a no-deal Brexit as Project Fear. Earlier, the head of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry told us the scenario should be avoided at all